After a grueling campaign season marked with a ticket change and assassination attempts, the most consequential election in modern U.S. history nears its end. With the two candidates seemingly polar opposites of each other, the results couldn't be any more different.
Will the glass ceiling finally shatter, or will it be a comeback? This afternoon, we watch history unfold as the world's most powerful nation decides. I'm George Cahiles.
And I'm Jamela Alindogan. This is BNC special coverage of the 2024 U.S. presidential elections.
Do we believe in the promise of America? And are we ready to fight for it? And when we fight, we win!
Make America safe again, and we will make America great again.
We begin with an update on the electoral vote count. So far, Republican candidate Donald Trump is leading the presidential race with 246 electoral votes based on the latest tally from Reuters. He only needs 24 more votes to clinch the presidency. Trump appears to be drawing more support than he did in his failed 2020 campaign. Meanwhile, U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris has 187. Results are still too early to call in battleground states that will decide the winner.
A bomb scare hit some polling locations in battleground states. In Georgia, at least 2 voting sites were briefly evacuated after being targeted by phony bomb threats. The FBI says these threats appear to have originated from Russian email domains, and none have been determined to be credible. And officials in Georgia also blaming Russia for the incident. Similar threats were received by the states of Arizona and Michigan.
I just want to make sure everyone understands this, that Georgia's not going to be intimidated. The Russia has just decided they picked on the wrong Georgia. They need to pick on the other one in the Black Sea, because we're not going to be intimidated. But we're just excited about where we are right now.
From the economy to immigration to the war in Gaza, here's what's at stake for Americans in the pivotal race for the White House.
The presidential election between Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump is in the home stretch. With the two offering starkly different visions for America, here's what's at stake in this election. Polls indicate that the two candidates are essentially tied, with voters trusting Trump slightly more on economic policies.
I was with me when our life was better with Trump. Yeah! Our life was so much better with Trump.
Much of the current Democratic administration has been hamstrung by high inflation, but price rises have recently cooled, and other economic indicators like stock markets are at near all-time highs.
I keep hearing some things are coming down, but I haven't seen it.
Both candidates have talked up their record in government in recent months while criticizing their opponents' economic plans. Harris has vowed to chart a new way forward with a focus on lowering prices for Americans.
Together, we will build a future where we build what I call an opportunity economy. So every American has the opportunity to own a home, to build wealth, to start a small business.
She's promised tax cuts for 100 million Americans while raising taxes on the richest and to bring down housing prices. While Trump has regularly vowed to eliminate inflation.
Starting on day one, we will end inflation and make America affordable again.
The former president has also vowed a 10 to 20% tariff on imports and a 60% rate on Chinese goods. The Republicans' protectionist economic message has focused on riling his largely white, working-class supporters by demonizing immigrants. The explosive issue of migration is what Trump hopes will help him win in November.
And you want Kamala? She opened and voted?
The U.S. government has struggled to manage its southern border with Mexico for years. Now the former president is doubling down on harsh rhetoric, accusing migrants of poisoning American blood.
We are going to start the largest mass deportation in the history of our country because we have no choice. It's not sustainable.
Polls show immigration remains a major vulnerability for Harris, with border crossings having risen to record highs at the end of 2023 under President Joe Biden.
I reject the false choice that suggests we must either choose between securing our border or creating a system of immigration that is safe, orderly, and humane. We can and we must do both.
Not only could the election have an impact on immigration, but also the fate of women's reproductive freedoms. In 10 states, a referendum on abortion rights will also be on the ballot, after the procedure was banned or restricted across much of the country, following a landmark Supreme Court ruling. In response, the Democratic Party has positioned themselves as the party of reproductive rights. And Harris has made access to abortion a central theme of her campaign.
And let us agree, and I know we do, one does not have to abandon their faith or deeply held beliefs to agree. The government should not be telling her what to do with her body.
Trump has consistently denied Democratic claims that he plans to pursue a national ban on abortion, despite pressure from conservative scholars and anti-abortion activists.
At the end of the day, this is all about the will of the people. You must follow your heart or, in many cases, your religion or your faith.
While Harris has gained support from many progressives at home on her stance on abortion rights, Harris's policies abroad could stand in her way of becoming president as she continues to uphold Biden's support for key U.S. ally Israel.
And may God bless the great alliance between Israel and America forever.
She has spoken little about the escalation in the Middle East as fears surrounding an all-out war intensify.
I can no longer in good conscience vote for the lesser of two evils.
Over the past year, Trump has claimed that the deadly October assault on Israel by Hamas would never have happened if he were in office.
I'm here today to tell the Jewish American community that this ugly tide of anti-Semitic, pro-Hamas bigotry and hate will be turned back and crushed starting at noon on January 20th, 2025.
Trump has hardly helped to cool rising tensions in the Middle East. Instead, he's threatened to blow Iran to smithereens after U.S. intelligence warned of threats from Tehran against his life. Democrats and a long list of former senior Trump presidential staff have sounded the alarm about a second Trump term.
They do not support Donald Trump coming back to the presidency, and I think that speaks volumes.
Some have warned of a repeat of the chaos that followed the 2020 election if he doesn't win this time around.
Of course there'll be a peaceful transfer, and there was last time, and there'll be a peaceful transfer. I just hope we're going to have honest elections, that's all, okay?
When we fight, we win!
Fight, fight, fight.
Joining us now for a discussion on the U.S. elections and what the results could mean for the relationship between Manila and Washington is Professor Renato De Castro of the De La Salle University. Professor De Castro, thank you for talking to us. It's good to see you again. First question, it is the most consequential election in recent history for the United States. How is it, though, that this race is so close?
Well, I think it has something to do with the fact that American politics is highly divided over a lot of domestic issues, primarily domestic issues, issues of inflation, issues of immigration, issue of reproductive rights, so forth and so on, and also in terms of taxes. But you notice most of the issues that are, of course, controversial are domestic. There's no discussion so much about foreign policy, except about little of Gaza and, of course, the support with Ukraine regarding, of course, Russian invasion of Ukraine. In terms of issues regarding the Indo-Pacific, issues regarding U.S.-China strategic competition, issues regarding the alliance, they were never discussed during this election.
So with Harris, there seems to be very contrasting approaches between the two candidates when it comes to foreign policy. as many see, Vice President Kamala Harris, if she wins, will most likely continue the multi-regional, multi-sectoral approach towards foreign policy. And many believe that the Trump return could return to a more transactional approach towards foreign policy decisions. What do you think, with these two constructing approaches, how can it impact America's defense ties with the Philippines, Professor?
Well, in terms, of course, of forms, you might have certain different approaches in terms of personal style. But when it comes to the substance, I don't see any dramatic changes. Because the key issue, of course, that involves us here in the Indo-Pacific region, and of course, think very much with our alliance, is the U.S.-China strategic competition. When it comes to this issue, there is a bipartisan consensus. Please take note that the decision to engage China in a strategic competition began during the Trump administration, 2017. After, of course, his attendance to the ASEAN summit in Vietnam, then later in Manila, when he came back to Washington, D.C., that's the time they started talking about China and, of course, Russia as being the peer competitor. And that, of course, basically continued way into the administration of Donald Trump. When the Biden administration took over, I still remember this when you have, of course, the confirmation of Secretary Antony Blinken. He basically said, we agree with the Trump administration. It's the Trump administration that made the very crucial decision that the United States should engage China in a strategic competition. It continued way into the Biden administration. And of course, this is also linked with the fact that there's a need for the United States to revitalize and hold on to its alliances, not only with the Philippines, but of course, alliance with Japan, alliance with South Korea, alliance with Australia, AUKUS, Quad, and to a certain degree, of course, the informal or the unofficial security relations with Taiwan.
Professor De Castro, well, the U.S.-Philippines alliance is, strongly backed by the Mutual Defense Treaty. And how should Manila prepare just in case either candidate, make some policy changes? How should we prepare for that?
I don't think there'll be any major change in terms of the alliance. In fact, you have to credit the Trump administration for at least saving the alliance during the time of then Rodrigo Duterte was hell-bent, of course, on unraveling the alliance. Please remember, in 2016, when he was in Beijing, he announced that he's leaving the United States, he's cutting ties with the United States, and he'll be gravitating towards Russia and China. Remember this in October 2016. Then the following year, of course, you have massive U.S. assistance to the armed forces of the Philippines incident, and you have Donald Trump coming to Manila during that, I think it's the ASEAN summit here. Yeah, we were the chair of ASEAN. And of course, he started his personal relationship with Rodrigo Duterte, former President Rodrigo Duterte. That basically saved the alliance. And I don't still remember in December 2018, when then Defense Secretary Delfin Lorenzana asked, would the United States honor its treaty commitment? March 2019, you have, of course, U.S. State Department Secretary then, Michael Pompeo coming to Manila and basically saying, we are reaffirming the alliance. Coming to Manila and basically saying, we are reaffirming the alliance. So during the time of President Donald Trump, the alliance was in a way was saved or protected from the the policy of the Duterte administration. It continued during the Biden administration. So I don't see any dramatic change in terms of our security relationship with the United States.
I have one question going back to Trump. He's been fairly sort of fighting for the election. America's talking quite years that Trump administration for financial contributions, for example, or some kind of protection fee, to put it bluntly, from allies like Taiwan. How do you think this could also impact our relationship with Washington? Officials should also worry about or think about should definitely Trump wins the election again.
Number one, of course, you raised the issue of protectionism. Actually, both Harris and Kamala Harris are, her policy are primarily for, increase in terms of burden. But he never raised that issue with the Philippines. In fact, he was all out in support to the Philippine government during the siege of Marawi and way to the end of his term. He's always been supportive. I still remember this November 2020 when it was apparent that he would be losing the election. He even sent his national security advisor, Tom Donilon, to basically assure the Duterte administration that the alliance is fine with me, and he's very much aware of the alliance. He tried basically to befriend and establish a very good relation with then former President Rodrigo Duterte, primarily, of course, to insulate the alliance from the former President Duterte's effort to unravel this.
I was speaking to retired Admiral Romel Ong the other night, and for a story that we're working on. Basically, he mentioned that, and I quote, the Philippines suffers from what he calls a curse of geography in relation to China's proximity, for example. How do you think should Manila, for example, turn sort of this curse of geography into a strategy to turn this geographical challenge into a strategic advantage? What do you make of that?
Well, that's why we have, of course, we have the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, basically allowing American forces access to our Enhanced Defense Cooperation site. That would basically at least provide us the support, just in case push comes to shove. You will have American forces here. This, of course, was signed in 2014. Former President Rodrigo Duterte tried not to implement the agreement during the early part of his term. He was convinced by former President Donald Trump when he went here to Manila during the ASEAN summit. I think it was around November 2017 that eventually, of course, President Rodrigo Duterte said, yeah, I would implement the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement with the United States. And of course, recently, under this administration, we had come out with the Comprehensive Archipelagic Defense Concept, which would entail, of course, enhancing our capabilities, both in terms of our, the capabilities of the Armed Forces of the Philippines, and more significantly, leveraging on our alliance with the United States, our security partnership with Japan, Australia, South Korea, and other like-minded countries. I don't think this will be affected by the change in administration in the United States. One thing is sure that will happen, of course, is that we will have a dramatic increase in U.S. defense spending, defense budget. That's a hallmark of the Republican, the Trump administration. And primarily, I guess, this is my bet, you will have the United States. There will be an attempt by the Trump administration to slowly disengage from supporting Ukraine, in this, given the Russian invasion of Ukraine. He has, of course, this kind of step towards supporting Ukraine. I could still remember in Brussels when he went to Brussels, even announced the depth and, of course, NATO becoming part of the Dutch beneficiary. Of course, this did not happen. Let's see what will be his relationship with NATO, North Atlantic, and his position regarding Ukraine. But I don't think it will affect his position regarding the Indo-Pacific region, and of course, in terms of the United States strategic competition with China.
Professor, let's go to the possible impact of the new administration to the Philippine economy. Can you give us an outlook, just in case a Trump or Harris administration will take over?
The Trump administration, again, it's Republican, will be more business-oriented. You'll have break to a lot of American corporations. You have, of course, removal of certain regulations that were imposed under the Biden administration. So it will be basically very good for American business. So I don't see it affecting our overall economic relations with the United States.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Renato De Castro of De La Salle University. We're taking a quick break. Stay with BNC's special coverage of the U.S. elections.
We're back, and you're still watching BNC's special coverage of the U.S. elections. The Electoral College, swing states, the winner-take-all rule, and early voting. Here's everything you need to know about how the next U.S. president will be elected.
Future is always worth fighting for. And that's the fight we are in right now, a fight for America's future.
Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump are hurtling towards their November 5th showdown in one of the closest elections in modern American history. But how does the country decide who gets to replace President Joe Biden? Here is everything you need to know about how the results of the election will be determined.
November 5th, 2024 will be called Liberation Day in America. We're going to be liberated.
The United States does not vote directly for a presidential candidate. Instead, Americans vote for one of 538 members of the Electoral College who designate the winner on their behalf. Each state is given a certain number of electors based on population. California, the most populous state, has 54, and Wyoming, the least populous state, has just 3. Candidates need at least 270 of the 538 Electoral College votes to win. States have a winner-take-all system that awards all of the electoral votes to whoever wins the popular vote in each state, aside from 2 exceptions, Nebraska and Maine, which split their electoral votes. Under the winner-take-all system, a candidate can be chosen by the Electoral College even if they receive fewer popular votes at the national level. This is what happened in the 2016 election, when Trump won against Hillary Clinton, even though she received nearly 3 million more votes nationally.
I know many of you are deeply disappointed about the results of the election.
Since most states usually lean either Democratic or Republican, the election tends to be decided by hotly contested swing states that have a history of alternating between the 2 parties. This year, there are 7 such battlegrounds: Pennsylvania, Georgia, Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada, Arizona, and North Carolina. Swing states account for 93, or nearly 1/5 of the total number of Electoral College votes. In a razor-thin election, just a handful of votes in any of those states could decide the outcome. On November 5th, when polling stations open, many voters will have already cast their ballot. Both Republicans and Democrats have been encouraged to vote early, in an aim to improve turnout and reduce crowds on the big day. In 2020, more than 100 million Americans cast their ballot in advance. Since his 2020 defeat, Donald Trump has launched an assault on the credibility of mail-in voting, claiming without evidence that the process was rigged against him. The first unofficial results could be announced as soon as polls close on the West Coast at 8 p.m. local time. Typically, American news media will declare the winner on election night, based on projections. However, in 2020, it took 4 days to call the election. Official results could take days or even longer due to the amount of mail-in ballots. Not until each state has certified its vote count will the country know for certain who will be the 47th President of the United States.
Let's continue our discussion on the 2024 presidential elections. The count still at 246 for Trump and 187 for Harris, based on the latest tally from Reuters. The most prized battleground state of Pennsylvania, of course, is still up for grabs at this point. And so now we're joined here in the studio by University of the Philippines Political Science Professor Herman Kraft. Professor, thank you for joining us here at BNC.
Thank you for having me.
It is the most consequential elections in recent U.S. history, and as you see, no one is ready to call it yet. Yeah. But let's look at first, going back to the actual approach. Let's compare how a Harris and Trump approach would differ when it comes to approaching the South China Sea. Harris is expected to hold a more multilateral approach, while Trump is expected to look at it as a kind of transactional bilateral approach. How do you think this will impact geopolitical relations, not just with allies already of the U.S., but those who are also trying to balance relations, other countries who are also trying to balance relations with China in the South China Sea?
Well, it's consequential in the sense that if you take a look at the Philippines, for instance, right? The idea has been, and I think this cuts across many of our policymakers' thinkings about the West Philippine Sea and the relationship and the impact of the relationship with the United States there. The idea is that, and I heard Dr. De Castro actually talking about it earlier on, and he said that there isn't going to be much of a difference whether it's going to be a Republican or a Democratic administration that's going to be sitting in the White House. And I think to a certain extent, that's probably true. That is to say that the next administration will come in with a sense that China has to be confronted, no, and therefore some sort of, I won't say reliance on allies, no, must come in, but that means there's an expectation on the part of the United States that its allies will actually will be batting for it, no, in the relationship with with China. I think it's the question of the approach that's going to we're going to see some sort of difference between the two. On one hand, no, the Biden administration's approach before was to emphasize multilateral arrangements, allies. No, that is to say that their approach to the Indo-Pacific would actually be based on their close ties with strategic partners within the region. And the thrust was to build those relationships, to strengthen alliances, and to build up or find or try to expand the number of more specific partners that it can actually work with, you know, as far as the relationship with China is actually concerned. So you can see that in terms of how they took a look at the relationship with the Philippines, right? So the strengthening of the mutual defense treaty was pretty much one of the high points, no, as far as the Biden administration was concerned, no, and its approach to the Asia-Pacific region. The interesting point here is that the expectation is that a Harris administration would actually just continue this approach to a large extent. For the most part, Republicans will probably take the same kind of position as far as China is concerned, but the approach is going to be very different, right? On one hand, the emphasis on multilateralism would actually be de-escalated, I think. And it's going to be more of the United States and its more direct approach, not towards China. And I think this is where the transactional sense, no, of how a Trump administration would actually approach the Indo-Pacific region comes in. Trump in the previous Trump administration actually preferred a more bilateral approach to how it dealt with not just China but actually even its allies in the region, right? And I think Dr. De Castro talked about this before. The difference between how it dealt with South Korea, for instance, making demands in terms of South Korea actually contributing more to the upkeep of American bases in South Korea. No, on the other hand, the relationship with Japan, no, which I think, no, was dealt with more on a more personal basis because of the approach that was taken by then Prime Minister Abe, no, to the United States. So in that context, the difference between the two administrations is very stark. On one hand, you have the Biden administration emphasizing, no, allies, no, multilateral approaches, no, and the Trump administration actually emphasizing bilateral arrangements. The interesting thing there is that the Philippines was relatively, there's a difference in the way that the Philippines was actually seen in both cases, right? During the Trump administration, we were hardly noticed, so to speak, right? In terms of American foreign policy towards the region. On the other hand, and of course, this is with respect to, with all respect, no, with the point that was made earlier on, that it was actually then Secretary Pompeo, who made more explicit the American ironclad guarantee of security for the Philippines, right? But that was actually a position that was continued by the Biden administration, that was actually strengthened through the implementation of the extended defense cooperation agreement with the Philippines, and of course the bringing in, if you will, of all the other allies, right? Trilateral with Japan and the Philippines, and of course AUKUS, and so on. So you think about those things, you can see the difference in the approach, right? Now, is this going to be any different if you have a Trump administration coming in? Intuitively, we'd actually say that, look, a Trump administration would actually be much more inward-looking, right? Their main concerns will be domestic politics, domestic policies, right? So which means that it would be logical for the United States then to bring in more of its allies into its approach as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned. But this runs counter to, I think, Trump's sense, right? That you don't trust your allies precisely because they're free riding as far as the American security guarantees are concerned, and therefore it's going to be more of the U.S. actually dealing with American interests in the region.
But there are other concerns, Professor, for example, that although there may be a planned approach, there are other factors that could impact the U.S.'s behavior in many ways. For example, events in the Middle East might actually, in many ways, as many experts fear, distract the U.S. from its pivot to Asia and pull it back into the Middle East region again with events in Gaza, with Israel bombing several countries at the same time. How much of this is likely to impact the United States foreign policy, you think? Whether it's Trump or Harris, but the events in the Middle East, for example.
Events in the Middle East will probably not change across the different, the possibility of a Harris or a Trump administration, right? There will be pressure as far as domestic political constituencies are actually concerned. Not for the United States to actually continue supporting Israel, as far as that issue is concerned. The interesting consideration here is to what extent is an Arab constituency in American domestic politics actually going to be influential in a Trump administration. Clearly, with a Harris administration, yes, more attention will be given there, right? That is to say that the demands to look at things more evenly between the Palestinians and the Israelis will probably be a key point in the domestic political scene for Kamala Harris. But the question is, to what extent is that going to be a sensitive point as far as a Trump administration is concerned? Clearly, Donald Trump's sentiments lean more towards Israel. There is he has good relations with Prime Minister Netanyahu, for instance. So the expectation really is that a Trump administration would be, and this is clear as far as Netanyahu's own positioning is concerned, right? That there is a sense that a Trump administration would actually be much more friendlier, if you will, and more sensitive to Israeli sensitivities about the conflict.
Professor, should Trump win? Professor De Castro was talking about the U.S. defense spending, that the U.S. might slowly disengage in some areas. Do you share the same sentiment? And could you please expound on that?
One of the things that that has actually been pivotal as far as Donald Trump's support is concerned is that there's always this emphasis that he's not a warmonger. The emphasis that it's the Democrats who are warmongers, right? So clearly there's an expectation that at the very least there won't be any new wars, there won't be any new deployments, right? And I think that was one of the things that the first Trump administration actually emphasized, right? And the supporters of Donald Trump then actually emphasizing, that there were no new wars that the U.S. actually engaged in, and therefore that was a plus factor as far as the base of the Republican Party was actually concerned. So at the very least, we can expect the same thing, right? That Donald Trump will actually be avoiding any new commitments as far as any new conflicts are actually concerned. So which begs the question then of if you go back to the first Trump administration, one of the things that people were very concerned about was the ratcheting up of the rhetoric against North Korea, right? Name calling, the obvious pointing out that the United States had a bigger nuclear arsenal than North Korea, and then all of that suddenly changed, right? All of a sudden, the North Korean leader was actually became best friends with Donald Trump. So the question there is, if we're looking at this situation right now, so any rhetoric on the part of Donald Trump, saber rattling that actually takes place, is probably going to be part of the deal making, that he likes to say that he is actually very good at, right? And therefore, he's not going to be taken seriously, as far as the possibility of actually going to war, and in fact, that's going to be one of the things that he will want to emphasize, that his administration will make sure that American soldiers are not going to be sent to foreign wars anytime soon.
Let's go back to the Philippine strategy. There are discussions by experts who said that there is a need for the Philippine government to kind of take on a de-risking approach when it comes to foreign policy. That means that as a middle power, or at least we have been described as a middle power, we have the unique ability in many ways to convene other nations to talk to us, both that strategic geopolitical situation that we have, our proximity to China. Do you think it is critical? We see that, for example, the Philippines is doing that by participating joint exercises with other countries. But how critical is this, you think, when it comes to a country like ours, a middle power, to be able to resist the tremors of whether of a political tremor within the U.S., domestically or international tremor, to keep the Philippines much more resistant and a buffer for its defense approaches. Do you think it's important?
It is, but let's go back to that idea of being a middle power first, right? I think the sense of being a middle power was something that came up in a study that was conducted by the Lowy Institute in Australia last year, where it listed a number of categories which actually showed where the strengths of different countries across the region lay. And as far as the Philippines was concerned, its strength was actually, its main strength was in not so much the convening power, but its defense networks. And at the center of that was actually the alliance with the United States, right? The interesting thing here is that if we are going to rely on the convening power of the Philippines, I think it's going to mean convening others, not just the United States.
Right.
Meaning to say that we're now looking at strengthening our ties with Japan, Australia, South Korea. And this is not just about us getting military equipment from them, but actually building some sort of diplomatic, maybe even a security network, that will come to the support of the Philippines in its situation as far as the West Philippine Sea is concerned. Okay, the issue has always been, and this even with the United States, right? To what extent is the expression of support going to translate into material support? Meaning to say presence, not just giving the Philippines equipment, but being there with with the Philippine military, for instance, when it's confronted, it's actually faced by harassments and all. So that's where this whole thing will actually be going. And I think if you think along those lines, that's a fundamental difference, I think, in terms of expectations between a Trump administration and a Harris administration, right?
Now let's talk about EDCA, sir. Speaking of translation to actual assets, do you think under a Trump or Harris administration, the implementation of EDCA will be faster here in the Philippines, or will it be the other way around?
My suspicion is that I will agree with the assessment made by Dr. De Castro earlier. There won't be much of a change as far as the speed of the upkeep of the sites. Right now they're building up those sites, and I don't think, and since this is a multi-year arrangement, I don't think they're going to stop that all of a sudden, just because there's a change in the administration. So to that extent, I think there won't be much of a difference between a Trump or Harris administration in terms of to what extent the EDCA as an agreement, and its implementation will actually be proceeding.
All right. We'll get more of Professor Kraft's take on the U.S. elections later on in the show. In the meantime, Philippines-U.S. ties take center stage at a watch party hosted by the U.S. Embassy this morning. U.S. Ambassador to the Philippines, Mary Kay Carlson, has this assurance to Filipinos. No matter who wins, the alliance between the two countries will remain stable. She also said the 700,000 Americans living in the Philippines right now is the bedrock of people-to-people ties between the two countries. Carlson also saying Washington's support for the Indo-Pacific will remain strong.
So what would a Harris or Trump presidency mean for the Filipino American community? We're now joined by Brendan Flores of the National Federation of Filipino American Associations. NAFA is a private, nonpartisan, and nonprofit organization which was established in 1997 to promote the active participation of Filipino Americans in civic and national affairs. Good afternoon, Brendan. I guess it's good evening to you.
Good morning, actually.
Oh, it's already
almost
good morning.
2 a.m. my time.
Good morning. Tell us, can you give us a sense exactly of what many Filipino Americans are feeling at the moment with the early election results coming in?
I think it's important to remember, though, that when you think about political affiliations, most Filipinos, roughly about 45%, identify as Democrats or lean Democrats, right? And about 28% align with the Republican Party. And notably, actually about 30% identify as independent. So I think you're getting mixed feelings from both sides with this election, because it's very close.
Okay. And how do you think, for example, Filipino Americans has long been a powerful voting bloc in the U.S., but how do you think over the past few years, for example, have issues like inflation, migration rights, healthcare actually steer their choices at the polls? How do you think that's impacted the way they vote and choose their candidates?
Yeah, I think, those are valid points. I think those are all top concerns of Filipino Americans, right, heading into the polls. When you think about economic concerns and inflation, jobs and the economy are paramount, right? As a matter of fact, about 80%, right, of Asian American voters, and that includes the Filipino American voters, right, because we're 20% of the Asian American segment, they consider that very important, right? So like all Americans, I would say Filipino Americans are impacted by rising inflation, with the cost of living becoming a pressing concern. So that was definitely something, that I'm sure every Filipino thought about when they head to the polls. When they headed to the polls, yeah.
There have been many reports, for example, Brendan, the Filipino migrants facing, wage theft, trafficking, migrant issues. Do you think, or have you witnessed, for example, any of these candidates speaking directly to the Filipino community in real, raw issues affecting everyday lives? Or do you think, if there's not enough of it, that the next administration should actually put a specific focus on Filipino American voters?
Yeah, I think they could always do a much better job, and I think it's a fact, right? I think nearly 40% of Asian American voters were actually contacted by either of the party. And again, I keep saying Asian Americans because we're a big portion of that. So I do think there's an opportunity. I would say, though, if you compare both presidential candidates, I think Kamala Harris is more appealing to the Filipino American segment because she has been very vocal about the healthcare and economic initiatives, as well as support for immigration reforms and obviously U.S. and Philippine relations.
Brandon, let's talk about the Filipino Americans who are running for various positions there in the U.S. Any news how they're appearing so far?
Yeah, I just got the news. Our dear friend, Assemblymember Stephen Raga, just won in the state of New York. So that is exciting for us. I haven't heard of other colleagues as of yet, but he was the most recent one. And again, the first Filipino American to be elected in a big state like New York. I think that is absolutely worth celebrating. And we can certainly keep you posted for the other folks. But so far, we have one. And the other colleagues might be able to share a little later on.
Well, that's great news. And how about, Filipinos are feeling right now? I mean, you, for example, this is like a nail-biting situation for everybody. How's the general feel in the U.S. For you, for instance? How is that?
Well, I'm at actually a Filipino American election watch party, and in the room you have pro-Harris and pro-Trump. So I think it just really depends on who they supported, right? I think it is important to note though that this year, prior to the election, 94%, roughly about 94% of Filipino American voters, indicated that they are voting, right? So that is definitely a significant improvement because the last presidential election. Only 54% of voter turnout, which was actually the lowest amongst Asian American subsegments. So this is, to me, definitely a significant improvement.
Brendan, anti-immigration rhetoric actually grew louder over the past few months, specifically on the Trump side. And there are many Filipinos at the moment, undocumented Filipinos across the U.S. What do you think is at stake for them should Trump wins? Again, the seat of the highest post in the United States. What do you think will be at stake? And what are you so concerned about?
I think the uncertainty in immigration policies will be an issue, right, for undocumented Filipinos. And that's definitely a significant concern because I think it's a fact that, Trump has a stricter immigration policy, which in the past, right, have led to visa restrictions and delays in family reunification. So I do think that is going to come up, right? Which is obviously a concern for the undocumented Filipinos.
Thank you, Brendan. And I wish you all the luck. We are all waiting with bated breath, as you know. Before we head into another break, let's take another look at the race to the 270 electoral college votes needed to win the U.S. presidency. U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris is trying to catch up with 194 electoral votes. Donald Trump is still leading with 246 electoral votes. We're taking another break, and still to come, a closer look at the two candidates battling it out for the White House. This is BNC special coverage of the U.S. elections. We'll be right back.
Welcome back. As we mentioned earlier, the Filipino American vote has been increasingly crucial, especially in the swing states. A recent report before the election showed they could even sway the results in the battleground state of Nevada. Joining us now to share his insights is Mark Calaguas, a founding board member of the National Filipino American Lawyers Association. Magandang umaga sa inyo dyan sa Amerika, Mark. How are you guys doing?
We were up pretty late for various reasons. One, to join, spend time with you. But obviously, we're in the middle of this very, nail biter election, post-election news coverage.
Can you give us a general feel of the situation there now in the U.S. as we await for the results of the elections?
Sure. So I think, I'm going to just parrot what what the analysis has been is that this is a very, close election. There's been a lot of polling, over the last few weeks and over, especially the last week, where basically taking it all together, it sounds like a toss-up. And right now, I think, we've had less close elections in kind of previous cycles. And so I think the electorate has been primed maybe to expect a decisive winner when they wake up. And as the tallies are, coming in, that might not be the case. It might be similar to what we saw, back in 2020. And so, I think just for it would be just a good idea for everybody to, sit and just wait for the results to come in and not jump to conclusions.
Yes. For Filipino Americans, how important is the result of these elections? What's going to be the impact to the Filipino American community with the Harris or Trump administration?
Well, as my colleague Brendan kind of mentioned, I think immigration is top of mind, but of course it's very complex, right? With President Trump, there was a lot of kind of really alarming, rhetoric with regard to, mass deportations and just, just the kind of dehumanizing kind of rhetoric, painting wide swaths of people as criminals. And, there was a hope that there would be some, kind of reversal with that under President Biden. And, there have been some continuities, since then. And I think for, some immigration advocates, they would like to see a little bit more progress. But certainly, what we've been seeing out of kind of the campaigns in the last few months has been continued to be alarming as well. And the possibility of, for example, mass, deportations, I think people really, need to kind of sit down and think what that actually mean as it be executed. These are our friends and our neighbors and our own families as well, including, our kababayan.
And many Filipinos are in swing states. How do you think they voted yesterday?
So one of the main problems is that as Filipino Americans, we continue to be invisibilized. And so I think as Brendan has pointed out, a lot of the data concerning that'll be relevant for our community is lumped under the larger, Asian American and Pacific Islander AAPI category, which, it serves some useful purposes for coalition building, right? And asserting kind of common political goals. But in terms of, the dozens of different ethnicities that make up AAPI, they all have, different immigration histories, different levels of education, and settlement patterns, which, means that our communities are not a monolith, and there's a lot of diversity in it.
Before I let you go, Mark, can you talk more about probably the challenges that Asian Americans would like to raise to the new administration, probably issues that you want the new administration to look on?
Sure. I think, access to social services is pretty important. There's been some, survey data that has indicated, Filipino Americans have kind of the highest reported, mental health and stress, levels. And that can be obscured by kind of our assimilation and, high English language fluency. But in fact, we have been under-resourced for many years, and certainly each new election cycle is a chance to kind of make our voices heard. Certainly, the ballot box is, an important venue, but it is not the only venue. So whatever the outcome of this election, let this be a call to our community to keep advocating and to, not and to not be quiet.
All right, thank you very much, Mark Calaguas, joining us from the United States. Despite legal challenges, former U.S. President Donald Trump is determined to return to the White House. Here's a closer look at the Republican presidential nominee and his rise as a political powerhouse.
We will make America great again.
Donald Trump's life has been defined by ambition, controversy, and spectacle. To some, he embodies the American dream. To others, he represents unchecked privilege and abuse of power. The fourth child of New York real estate mogul Fred Trump, Donald was born into wealth. His personal life has been a public spectacle. 3 marriages, tabloid scandals, and a string of sexual misconduct allegations. Court rulings have since awarded millions in defamation damages. Trump's career has been driven by relentless ambition. But his famous show The Apprentice and his "You're fired" catchphrase made him a household name.
Kamala, you're fired. Get out of here.
Although his business image wasn't flawless, bankruptcies and tax filings exposed years of chronic losses. Trump entered the 2015 presidential race, rallying his base with a call to restore the so-called American dream and secure U.S. borders. Under Make America Great Again, he trounced his way through the Republican primary and eventually defeated Hillary Clinton.
The President of the United States.
His presidency was transformative yet divisive, marked by tax cuts, strict immigration policies, a trade war with China, and the U.S. withdrawal from key global agreements. The end of his presidency brought chaos. After his 2020 loss, Trump declared election fraud, igniting a January 6 rally that erupted into the Capitol riot. A day that led to his second impeachment. Despite that, his grip over the Republican Party grew. And at 78, Trump is back, leading the campaign trail while facing 91 felony charges from election interference to fraud. Despite these challenges, his monumentum has not slowed. An assassination attempt at a Pennsylvania rally only deepened his base's fervor. Trump's ambitious Project 2025 outlines sweeping changes from immigration to federal authority. He proposed to bringing the entire federal bureaucracy, independent agencies like the Department of Justice, under presidential control.
And we will put these vicious and bloodthirsty criminals in jail, or we'll kick them the hell out of our country as fast as we can.
Critics argue that this 900-page blueprint reads like a conservative manifesto, offering the next Republican president expanded executive powers and embedding a hardline social agenda across the United States. He has since distanced himself from it, but experts say it offers a snapshot of what the United States could look like under a second Trump presidency.
Message of hope for all Americans with
Trump rival Kamala Harris, on the other hand, aims to make history in her White House run. If she wins, she becomes the first woman and Asian American to lead the most powerful nation on earth.
We are all here because we are fighting for a democracy and for the right of people.
Vice President Kamala Harris is no stranger to power. Yet, with just weeks before Election Day, she's working tirelessly to connect with the American public and make her case for the presidency. In 2021, Kamala Harris made history as the first woman, Black American, and South Asian American to be sworn in as vice president. Born in 1964 to a Jamaican father and an Indian mother, Harris often speaks about how her parents' immigrant journeys in the U.S. shaped her early life and instilled in her a commitment to justice.
Fighting for the best of who we are.
Harris began her legal career in 1990. prosecuting child sexual assault cases, a work she describes as foundational for her future in public service. In 2004, she became San Francisco's district attorney, breaking new ground by officiating the city's first same-sex marriage. Elected as California's Attorney General in 2010, she led the nation's largest state justice department, cementing her role as a trailblazer. In 2022, Harris made a historic visit to the Philippines, traveling to Palawan to meet with residents and Coast Guard officials. Her visit, as the highest-ranking U.S. official to step foot in the region, sent a strong message of the U.S.'s commitment to the Philippines and firm support for South China Sea defense. Her connection to the Philippines extended further. Her husband, Douglas Emhoff, represented the U.S. at President Ferdinand Marcos Jr.'s inauguration, carrying a personal message from President Biden and pledging continued support to combat COVID-19. When President Joe Biden stepped aside in the presidential race, Harris swiftly accepted his endorsement and declared her candidacy.
I accept your nomination to be President of the United States of America.
As she secured the Democratic nomination, her promises echoed Biden's core policies, upholding democratic values and the rule of law, restoring abortion rights, urgently addressing climate change, and pushing tax reforms that favor the middle class. The first few months of her campaign were marked by fierce debates where Harris held her ground. Yet, as the economy emerged as a top concern, she began pivoting her message, framing Trump as a grave threat to democracy and sharpening the ideological divide. She intensified her tone, calling Trump a fascist and urging voters to turn the page on a divisive era in American politics.
Donald Trump is even more unstable and more unhinged, and now he wants unchecked power. And this time, there will be no one there to stop him.
In recent months, Harris has focused on reaching undecided voters and moderate Republicans, though she has often sidestepped specific policy details on border security, healthcare, and the Gaza conflict. Her rhetoric, however, has remained strong, casting Trump as an existential threat to democracy.
The Constitution of the United States should never again stand behind the seal of the President of the United States of America. Never again.
If elected, Harris faces an agenda packed with domestic and international challenges. From border security and the Ukraine crisis to tensions over Taiwan, Israel, and Gaza. And in Southeast Asia, another question looms: how Harris will navigate complex alliances, building closer ties with regional partners while managing the delicate balance with China.
Do we believe in freedom?
With a tight race and the world watching, Kamala Harris stands poised to make history once again, carrying the weight of a deeply divided America and a fractured world on her shoulders.
And when we fight, we win!
We're taking another break. Stay with us here on BNC.
The swing states are the states which could tip the scales and decide the US presidential election. In these states, the outcome of the vote is uncertain, unlike the vote in Democratic or Republican strongholds. So candidates concentrate their campaigning efforts on these states. In Ohio, for example, the pendulum swung to a Democratic majority in the House of Representatives in 1984. It switched back to the Republicans in 1994, except from 2008 to 2010. In 2000, the very close result in Florida swung the presidential election in favour of George W. Bush. Then the state, after giving its electoral college votes twice to Barack Obama, voted for Donald Trump in 2016. The swing states change over time. In 2024, the main key states are expected to be Pennsylvania, Georgia, Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada, Arizona, and North Carolina.
Welcome back to BNC special coverage of the 2024 U.S. elections. And here's another look at the vote count. Donald Trump is just 5 electoral college votes away from winning the U.S. presidency. He now has 265 votes based on the latest tally from Reuters. U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris trails with just 194. Let's now turn our focus to the impact of the elections to the Philippine economy. We're now joined by George Barcelon of the Philippine Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Mr. Barcelon, thank you for talking to us. How do you think our election bets affecting the movement of the peso at the moment?
Well, so far with all the numbers that I've been reading, looks like the odds is in favor of President Trump being reelected. But having said that, I think their policy with regard to trade, both administration has been very consistent. They have put sanctions on China, and with some of the pronouncement of President Trump, but that he might put sanctions also on countries that are friends of the U.S. So that may not bode too well for us on our exports. But I just heard that the statement that was made by our ambassador from U.S., Her Excellency Mary Kay, that all the previous commitments of the U.S. government to the Philippines still stands. I remember meeting with the Secretary of Commerce, Raimundo, Gina Raimundo she was here, and she talked about supporting the Philippines in the upskilling of our workers and all of that. And I think hopefully that will continue, or that will materialize. We need that to advance our industry to more current requirement of the Industrial Revolution 4. So I hope that will be kept their promise to us, considering that we have committed additional EDCA, enhanced defense agreement. This would, in a way, they live up to their words, while we have committed ourselves in helping them provide more bases for the U.S.
Mr. Barcelon, what do you think are the pros and cons of a Harris presidency to the Philippine economy? I mean, of course, it looks as if Trump is tipped for another term, but let's just go back and think that a possible Harris presidency is also quite highly. How do you think she would approach the issue of the economy and its trade deals with the Philippines? Or do you think there won't be much difference?
If you notice, when President Biden was elected, replacing President Trump 4 years ago, he continued the sanctions that was imposed on China. Earlier, we thought that with the Democratic administration, they would be more open about it. They would not maintain the isolationist approach of President Trump. But apparently, they continue. But now, as we see some of the pronouncement of President Trump, or the newly elected President Trump, that he will impose even more sanction, not only on China, but on some of their friends. Yes. So it's, but of course, the situation now is not yet final. We'll have to wait until the final call that the candidate Kamala Harris concede to former President Trump. Then we can see some of the clearer strategy or clearer trade policies that Trump will make. Hopefully, it will be in our favor. When the administration, both administration, Trump and President Biden, aired their concern about their supply chain depending too much on China. So a lot of factories actually really decoupled or relocated to other countries in ASEAN, which is primarily Vietnam. We hope we could get some of these investments, but the number doesn't really fare us out. No, we did not get that much. Maybe the second time around that we will be able to get more
No more
investments.
questions. Okay. Just a quick last questions to bring up, to pick up from what you mentioned. A trade war with China under a Trump presidency, how do you think that's going to impact the Philippine economy?
Well, that will continue, but it's a question between the U.S. and China. Okay. For us, our supply chain also rely a lot on China, and that may give us some leeway if the supply is quite abundant from China. Maybe they will supply the Philippines with more favorable. That's all I can think of. Also, the fact that China realized that they have really prime the local economy, and we have been really eyeing the agri products such as fruits, durian, and other banana, pineapple. Maybe they would take a second look at the Philippines once the geopolitical concern has lessened. For a while, knowing that we are geopolitical connected to the U.S., and China sort of reacted by not buying from the Philippines. Mm-hmm. Now with Trump, I really don't know. But one thing that is definitely clear about world's geopolitics is that Trump has mentioned that he would want the Ukraine war to stop immediately. And if that were to happen, then definitely the supply chain coming out of Ukraine and Russia will fare better.
Okay. Do you think how do you think that's likely to impact the peso? Like, for example, the war in Ukraine, the trade war in China. How do you imagine, assess?
The one with China, as I said, that many factories are relocating their operations, but sad to say, not to the Philippines. Mm-hmm. Now, on the impact on the Ukraine war, I surmise that some of the commodity that we buy out of food-related out of Russia and Ukraine will make maybe the price will soften. When the war started, everything went. All the prices of this food commodity jacked up, even power-related. So we'll see how that plays out. No? But hopefully, if the war sort of tempered a bit, maybe the economic side of trade will benefit our country.
Okay, as expected, geopolitical tremors could really impact the economy, whether it's big or small. Thank you so much, PCCI Chairman George Barcelon. Thank you for talking to BNC. And still with us here in the studio, Professor Herman Kraft of the University of the Philippines. He's a political science professor in UP. Sir, thank you for staying with us. We're seeing the recent electoral votes coming in, and it looks like it's tipped for another Trump presidency. But before we discuss Trump, let's review the last few months. When Harris was chosen as the Democratic nominee, there was a surge, right? Not only of her ratings and support, but also of donations. But somewhere along the way, she sort of plateaued, her campaign has plateaued. And in a last-ditch effort, she pitched, right? Her last pledge was to end the Gaza-War conflict as a kind of last-minute move to appeal to Arab Americans. Do you think that's a little too late? Let's reassess that campaign strategy of Vice President Kamala Harris, Professor.
I think it was late simply because you already had a lot of people who had voted. And so chances are that particular pitch didn't really change the situation as far as votes cast is actually concerned, right? And to a certain extent, it seemed like it was more of a desperate gambit more than anything else, as opposed to seeing it as a consistent policy position. And so for those who are voting now, right, or at least those who voted, the question would have been, does that convince them that this somehow shows a change of heart as far as the Democrats are actually concerned with regards to the the war in Gaza, right? And so might have been too late, too little too late, so to speak, at that particular point in time.
But it also shows one thing, that Arab American votes are critical.
Well, it's showing that because of the Electoral College, right? And I think this is the critical point here, that that communities, if they have significant concentrations in certain states, if they decide to actually vote significantly in favor of a particular candidate, then they can swing the situation. And I think this was seen as far as Michigan was concerned, where you had a lot of Arab Americans making their displeasure known as far as how the Biden administration was actually approaching the war in Gaza. And so there was this rather difficult situation for the Harris campaign, where the signaling was that you guys actually have to give us more, right? You can't just take for granted that we're going to be voting Democrat as far as the presidential elections are concerned, because of historical reasons, right? The fact that they did not see any change, nor at least attempts on the part of the Biden administration to significantly change Israel's actions in Gaza, actually showed just how much a particular issue could mobilize a particular community into becoming a swing community as far as votes are concerned. But this shows the funny situation where, in a swing state like Pennsylvania, a small district in Pennsylvania could basically determine the fate of the world, so to speak, right? Sure. A vote here and there that actually swings Pennsylvania in favor of either Trump or Harris, is going to be a decider as far as what's going to happen. I mean, we're talking about the most powerful country in the world, right? And so there's that ironic kind of situation that we're all facing, and that's why we're also interested in what's going on in the U.S.
For our audience, if you could just explain to us, because the setup of the presidential elections and vote counting are quite different. Tell us what determines what is an electoral vote, and how does it tally and compare with the popular vote?
Okay. For most states, and I think your earlier video showed that Maine and Nebraska are the two states that actually have a different way of tallying electoral votes, right? But for most states, there's a fixed number of electoral votes based on the population. Right. And so that's the reason why when counting actually started, right, there seemed to be a landslide in favor of Trump because of the number of electoral votes he was actually getting, which were in those states or from those states that were smaller in number, right? Smaller in number in terms of population, therefore smaller in number of electoral votes. But it's because of the smaller number of votes being tallied, the results were faster to count, right? So that explains why you did see that apparent landslide in favor of Trump. But for larger states, right, they have more electoral votes. So states like, for instance, California, Texas, New York, and Florida, for instance, these are states that actually have a larger number of electoral votes based on the populations that they actually have. So which basically means that there are certain states that I won't say that they can actually determine the election, but the number of electoral votes that they actually have depends on the number of popular. It's different from the popular. The popular vote is really a first past the post kind of system. Right. I mean to say that it's determined by the number of total votes that a candidate actually gets from within a state. The relationship between the popular vote and the electoral vote is that whoever wins the popular vote in most states, right? In most states, whoever wins the popular vote in a state can actually win the all the electoral votes for that state. So it's a winner-take-all kind of system. Like I said, there are other states that have a different system, like Nebraska and Maine have allocate different electoral votes to different districts. No, so while the popular vote, it's quite possible for a candidate to win the popular vote and yet lose the electoral vote.
Okay. After when Trump won the presidency, there's one of the issues, right?
Yeah.
When he beat Hillary Clinton,
yeah.
and there were calls to abolish basically the electoral vote system. What do you make of that, and how difficult is it to change the electoral structure of the United States?
Yeah, it's going to be very difficult because any attempts to actually change the electoral system in the U.S. would require a referendum that would have to go through all the states.
Right.
Right? You have states that have been, and I think to that question, right? It would be the Democrats that would be in favor of changing the electoral system, precisely because if we're talking about this question about the Electoral College, it's based on the history of the past 8 elections for the presidency, no? And in those cases, no, a number of situations where the Republicans won. Only one Republican president actually got the majority popular vote, right? All in the past, in this past elections, no, most of the those who have won the presidency, who were from the Republican Party, right, actually won through the electoral vote, not through the popular vote. So there's this question that is that democratic, right? But I think this is the point, right? That the system was actually introduced at the time when the Constitutional Convention was actually trying to determine how to actually balance between the one person, one vote system, right? And the idea of retaining sovereignty within the states, right? And so the Electoral College was actually the compromise that came out of that particular system.
Now, Professor, earlier former President Trump was quoted that he will only lose if there was cheating.
Yeah.
What can you say about that, sir?
One of the things that the Trump campaign has actually been accused of, right, is that it was basically creating a situation where the only acceptable result of the election was one where he had won, right? And acceptability is not just Trump himself, but in terms of his base, right? So they're not willing to accept. He was actually creating a mindset that
conditioning.
He was conditioning people, his base basically, that if he loses the election, right, it's because the Democrats actually cheated, right? And the cheating there is all about, basically making sure that two possibilities: people who are supposed to vote are prevented from voting, and the second, and this is the more likely scenario that they're actually pushing, is that people who should not vote, are still voting.
All right. Professor Kraft, we will just bring in the latest count of the Electoral College vote. 266 votes for Republican candidate Donald Trump. Just 4 more before he officially retakes the White House. U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris still has 194. All right. Medyo malapit na talaga, sir, ano? We're inching closer to the results of the U.S. elections. And maybe a final word from you, sir.
Before that, I just wanted to ask.
Yeah.
Okay.
2 assassination attempts on Trump, right? Lots of cases logged in. I mean, a conviction in many ways, right? And here he is about to retake the presidency. People seem to have forgotten the January. So It's almost like they say, as journalists would say, truth is often more stranger than fiction. As a geopolitical analyst, did you ever imagine this to happen when we were looking at events on January 16, 2020, that a president, US president, leaving the White House in that manner would have once again be propelled back to power?
There are two points to the question, right? The first one has to do, could we imagine that January 6th was going to happen? And I think it was beyond our capacity to actually think about it. But the other thing, to your question is, somebody was responsible for that, and yet people are going to put their trust in him, right? Actually shows I think a shift in the way that the American electorate actually thinks about not just elections but politics in the US, right? Sure. There was this article that I saw earlier on, I mean several years back, which basically talked about the idea that, look, if you compare Russia and the United States, right, Americans actually trusted their institutions, that institutions provided guardrails against tyranny, against demagoguery, and the abuse of power. Okay, whereas Russians basically trusted, the person, right, and that explains why, despite everything that he did or he does, Vladimir Putin still keeps on getting elected. So, which basically means that if you think about what's going on now, okay, that idea of Americans trusting institutions seems to be shifting a little bit, right? I don't know if it is a particularly it's a particular phenomena that centers around the personality of Trump, right? Or whether it shows a certain shift, in the attitudes, of Americans towards politics, that there is more of a trust being placed in persons, right? Personalities, as opposed to, of course, the idea that your institutions are actually going to make sure that things are actually going to go right. Okay, this question of and you can see this in how strong the belief is, as far as Trump's argument, the point that you were making earlier on, the argument that, look, I'm not going to lose unless they cheat, right?
Professor, are you seeing any similarities in the behavior of Filipinos and Americans in terms of how they vote?
Actually, it's more of Americans are becoming more Filipino-like in terms of how they're voting, right? Our politics has always been about personalities, right? That's why we have very weak political parties, for instance, right? Our parties aren't organized around ideologies. They're not organized around programs, right? So we always talk about the person, right? Who are you voting for? No, it's not. We don't think in terms of Democrats and Republicans. Yeah, sure. I'd be surprised if we even remember which was the strongest party in the representatives now. Okay, so which means that our politics has always been very personality oriented. Okay, I won't say that the U.S. is moving in the same direction, but we are seeing that that American politics is now actually allowing for. Right? It might, like I said, it might be a phenomena that's only generic to the times, but we're seeing in the case of Trump, a shifting from a more institutional way of looking at politics to one that actually gives more emphasis not to who it is that people are actually voting for.
We can't look at the Biden re-election without looking at what President Biden has done or failed to do.
Right.
If you would assess, for example, because it all leads back to Biden, right? What do you think were possibly the policies that made his administration effective, and what do you think were the shortcomings that allowed for a window
for Trump to come back?
Exactly, for a Trump comeback. What do you think were the shortcomings in terms of policy? I know that the economy is a sticking point. Do you think that's really the economy? As the strategist of former Bill Clinton said, it's the economy, stupid.
Right. Yeah.
Do you think that's still the case?
See, this goes back to what I was saying earlier on, right? Because policies are still pretty much a matter of institutions, right?
Yeah.
The interesting thing here is that the Democrats can point to all the numbers that they can show, right? That illustrates how successful the Biden administration was, in terms of the economy, in terms of COVID, their policies around COVID, as well as, of course, the issue that had to do with foreign policy, right? They can show numbers, they can show cases that illustrates how important the Biden administration's policies were, right? And the successes that were there, okay? But people don't believe them, right? I mean, talk about this question of job numbers, for instance, right? Yeah. If you take a look at one of the most consistent numbers that the Biden administration has actually been able to show is the success in terms of creating jobs, right, over time, okay? And yet, it seems that doesn't matter, right? So if you're talking about it's the economy stupid, right? The fact is, a good economy isn't the fact of a good economy or a successful economy isn't convincing the American people, the electorate. So it's interesting how that's actually working out.
Interesting times, definitely. Thank you for sharing your insight on the U.S. elections. UP Political Science Professor Herman Kraft, it's been a real pleasure. My thanks. The pivotal race for the White House is coming to a close, and Donald Trump is poised for a comeback. After a highly polarizing election season, how can Americans come together for its 47th president?
How will another Trump presidency impact the world? Only time will tell. I am George Kainas.
And I'm Jamela Alindogan. This has been BNC's special coverage of the U.S. presidential elections. Thank you for joining us.
To fight for it. And when we fight, we win.
Make America safe again. And we will make America